Ben Miller was a typical 26-year-old living in the small, sleepy town of Brooksville. Married to his high school sweetheart, Claire, he was the kind of guy who everyone thought had his life together. A steady job at his father-in-law's construction company, a cozy little house on Maple Street, and a seemingly happy marriage. But behind the scenes, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. For months, Ben had been leading a double life. By day, he was the devoted husband and hard-working employee. By night, he was entangled in a secret affair with someone no one would have expected, his former high school teacher, Sarah Willoughby. Sarah, now 45, had been Ben's English teacher a decade ago. She was sophisticated, charismatic, and everything Ben's routine life was not. The affair started innocently enough. Ben had run into Sarah at a local coffee shop. They chatted about the good old days, and she seemed genuinely interested in his life. One coffee turned into several, and before he knew it, they were sneaking around together. It was thrilling for Ben, a dangerous game that gave him an adrenaline rush he hadn't felt in years. But what Ben didn't know was that Sarah had her own reasons for keeping him close. Sarah was in the middle of a bitter divorce. Her husband, Richard, was leaving her for a younger woman, and it seemed like the whole town knew. She was desperate to prove she was still desirable, still in control. Seducing Ben wasn't just about attraction, it was about power. She enjoyed the feeling of having a young, handsome man wrapped around her finger, sneaking out at night just to see her. The affair continued for months, with Ben lying to Claire about working late or hanging out with friends. He was good at keeping his secret, or so he thought. Claire was no fool. She noticed the changes in Ben, the extra cologne, the sudden interest in his appearance, and the way he would disappear for hours with no explanation. She confronted him several times, but Ben always had an excuse. Claire wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. Then, things took a darker turn. One evening, while Ben was with Sarah at her house, there was a knock on the door. It was Richard, Sarah's estranged husband. He had suspected something was going on and had finally caught them together. Furious, he threatened to expose their affair to everyone, including Ben's wife. Ben panicked, but Sarah was surprisingly calm. She told Richard to leave and that they would talk about it later. The next morning, Richard was found dead in his car, parked on a remote dirt road outside of town. The coroner's report ruled it as a suicide, an overdose of prescription pills. But rumors started circulating. Richard wasn't the type to take his own life, and those who knew him well said he would never go down without a fight. The police started looking into Sarah, who was the last person to see Richard alive. She claimed that he had come over to talk and left after a brief argument. There was no evidence to suggest foul play, so the case was closed as a tragic suicide. Ben was relieved, but something about Sarah's behavior made him uneasy. She was too nonchalant, almost as if she had expected it to happen. Meanwhile, Claire's suspicions about Ben continued to grow. One night, after he had left for another late shift, she decided to follow him. She trailed his car, keeping a safe distance until he pulled up to Sarah's house. Heartbroken and furious, Claire watched from the shadows as her husband embraced the older woman. Overwhelmed with anger, Claire drove back home, her mind racing. She knew she had to confront Ben, but she needed to gather her thoughts first. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a chain of events that would lead to a shocking and violent conclusion. Claire felt numb as she drove home, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to confront Ben, but she knew he'd deny everything, just like he always did. As she parked her car in the driveway, she made a decision. She would gather evidence, something undeniable, before she confronted him. Over the next few days, Claire meticulously collected everything she could find: phone records, messages, and even pictures of Ben leaving Sarah's house. It was painful, but she needed the truth to be undeniable. She planned to confront him with all the evidence at once, leaving him no room for lies. Meanwhile, Ben was growing more uneasy around Sarah. After Richard's death, she had become more possessive, more demanding. It was as if she wanted him to fill the void left by her husband's absence. She started talking about them moving in together, even discussing what their life would look like in the future. The thrill of the affair was gone, replaced by a sense of dread. Then, Sarah made a shocking revelation. They were lying in bed, and she turned to him with a strange look in her eyes. "Ben, I know this sounds crazy, but What if Richard didn't kill himself? She said, her voice barely a whisper. Ben sat up, his heart racing. What do you mean? The police said it was a suicide. Sarah hesitated, then continued. I just mean, what if someone made it look like a suicide? Someone who knew he was going to expose us. Someone who wanted to protect us. Ben felt a chill run down his spine. Was she implying what he thought she was? Sarah, did you have something to do with Richard's death? She smiled, a cold, calculating smile that made Ben's blood run cold. Of course not, darling. I'm just saying, isn't it convenient how everything worked out? Ben didn't know what to say. He had always thought Sarah was just a lonely woman seeking comfort in his company. But now he realized there was something much darker beneath the surface. He knew he had to get out of this relationship, but how? Sarah was clearly unstable, and he didn't know what she was capable of. Back at home, Claire had reached her breaking point. She decided to confront Ben that evening. Armed with the evidence she had collected, she waited for him to come home. When he walked through the door, she unleashed her fury. She threw the photos and messages at him, demanding to know the truth. Ben tried to deny it at first, but Claire's anger and the overwhelming evidence left him with no choice. He confessed to the affair, apologizing profusely and begging for forgiveness. Claire was devastated, but her anger quickly turned to fear. When Ben told her about Sarah's strange behavior and her suggestion that Richard's death might not have been a suicide, Claire knew they had to go to the police. But Ben was terrified. What if she knows we're talking to the cops? She's already proven she's dangerous, he pleaded. But Claire was adamant. They couldn't keep quiet any longer. They decided to gather more information about Sarah and then go to the police with everything they had. The next day, Ben called Sarah and told her he needed to end things. He couldn't live with the guilt anymore and wanted to work things out with his wife. Sarah's reaction was not what he expected. She was eerily calm, almost as if she had anticipated this. I understand, Ben. I always knew you'd go back to her eventually. But remember, I know things about you, and I can make your life very difficult if you try to leave me. Ben hung up, his hands shaking. He knew then that he and Claire were in real danger. Sarah was not going to let him go that easily. That night, Ben and Claire sat in their living room, trying to figure out what to do next. They were scared, unsure of who to trust. Then the phone rang. It was a blocked number. Claire answered hesitantly. Hello? A distorted voice came through the line. You think you can betray me and get away with it, Ben? The voice said. Claire felt her blood freeze as she recognized the voice. It was Sarah. We know everything about you, Sarah. We're going to the police, Claire said, her voice shaking. There was a pause. Then Sarah's voice, cold and calm. You think the police can help you. You have no idea what I'm capable of. The line went dead, and Claire dropped the phone, her hands trembling. They were in over their heads. Sarah was dangerous, and now she knew they were planning to go to the police. The night after Sarah's call, Ben and Claire could barely sleep. Every creak in the house, every shadow outside seemed ominous. They knew Sarah was capable of anything, and now they felt trapped. The next morning, they decided it was time to go to the police, no matter the risk. At the police station, they met Detective Andrea Sullivan, a seasoned investigator who listened intently as they recounted everything: the affair, Richard's death, and Sarah's threatening behavior. Detective Sullivan had a reputation for being relentless and was already familiar with Richard Willoughby's case. She had always suspected something was off, but lacked the evidence to prove it. Hearing Ben and Claire's story, she felt they might finally have the missing pieces. We'll look into Sarah's background and her connection to Richard's death again, she said, jotting down notes. But you two need to be very careful. If she's as dangerous as you say, confronting her could provoke her into doing something drastic. Feeling a little relieved, but still on edge, Ben and Claire returned home. They decided to stay at Claire's parents' house for the next few days, hoping to keep a low profile until the investigation moved forward. Detective Sullivan, meanwhile, dug into Sarah's past, discovering a trail of manipulative relationships and shady financial dealings. It seemed Sarah was an expert at getting what she wanted from wealthy men, but there had never been any evidence linking her to criminal activity until now. As days passed, Ben and Claire tried to resume some semblance of normalcy, though they were always looking over their shoulders. Then, one evening, Detective Sullivan called with an update. "We've found something interesting," she said. It turns out that Sarah had been buying large large quantities of sedatives over the past year. That's not necessarily illegal, but combined with your account of Richard's death, it's suspicious. Do you think she drugged Richard? Claire asked, her voice trembling. We can't be sure yet, but it's a possibility we're looking into, Sullivan replied. I've also found something else. Sarah recently took out a large insurance policy on Richard, with herself as the sole beneficiary. She cashed it in right after his death. The pieces were starting to fit together. Sarah had manipulated Ben, driven Richard to the edge, and now she was closing in on her next target. Sullivan urged Ben and Claire to stay out of sight and remain vigilant while she gathered more evidence. That night, they received another call from a blocked number. This time, Claire answered on speakerphone, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. What do you want, Sarah? Sarah's voice was cold, devoid of emotion. I warned you, Ben. I told you not to cross me. Now, you've left me no choice. What are you talking about? Ben demanded, his heart pounding. I'm outside your house. Why don't you come out and we can talk face to face, she said, her voice eerily calm. Ben rushed to the window, but there was no sign of Sarah outside. Panic set in as he realized she must be watching from somewhere. You're insane, Sarah. Leave us alone, he shouted into the phone. Oh, Ben, she laughed softly. You have no idea what I'm capable of. The line went dead, and Ben frantically called Detective Sullivan, explaining what had happened. She promised to send a patrol car to keep an eye on the house and advised them to leave immediately and stay somewhere safe. They packed a few essentials and headed to a hotel on the other side of town. They checked in under fake names and tried to calm their nerves. Hours passed without incident, but just as they started to relax, there was a knock at the door. Claire's heart sank as she looked through the peephole and saw a police officer standing outside. She opened the door cautiously. Detective Sullivan sent me, the officer said. We've been keeping an eye on your house, and it looks like someone broke in after you left. We need you to come with us to the station. Ben and Claire exchanged nervous glances, but followed the officer. At the station, Detective Sullivan showed them the surveillance footage from outside their house. It was grainy, but it clearly showed Sarah trying to force open a window. After failing to get in, she left in a hurry, looking frustrated. She's escalating, Sullivan said grimly. We're issuing a restraining order, but it's clear she's not going to back down. What should we do? Claire asked, her voice shaky. You need to stay somewhere safe. Do you have anyone you can trust? Sullivan asked. Claire thought for a moment. My brother has a cabin out in the woods. It's isolated and no one knows about it except family. That's perfect, Sullivan agreed. Stay there and keep your phones on. I'll keep you updated. They drove to the cabin, the fear gnawing at them as they navigated the dark, winding roads. When they finally arrived, they locked every door and window and tried to settle in for the night. But the unease lingered, the sense that Sarah was always one step ahead. The next morning, as the sun rose over the treetops, Claire's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number, and her blood ran cold as she read the message. Nice place. I'll be seeing you soon. Ben and Claire stared at the message, their fear palpable. How had Sarah found them? They felt trapped, like prey being stalked by a relentless predator. The air inside the cabin seemed to grow colder as they realized that the only way to end this nightmare was to confront her once and for all. Call Detective Sullivan, Ben whispered. Claire's hands were shaking as she dialed the number. She knows where we are. We need help. We're already on our way, Sullivan said. Stay inside and don't let her in. We'll be there in 15 minutes. But 15 minutes was too long. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the back of the cabin. Sarah had found them and was trying to break in. Ben grabbed a kitchen knife and stood in front of Claire, ready to protect her at any cost. Ben, come out, or I'll burn this place to the ground, Sarah screamed from outside, her voice wild with rage. Terrified, Claire stepped back, clutching her phone. Just as Sarah shattered a window and reached inside, they heard the distant sound of sirens. Sarah froze, realizing her time was up. She turned to run, but was intercepted by Detective Sullivan and her team, who tackled her to the ground. It's over, Sarah, Sullivan said, handcuffing her as she struggled. You've lost. As the police led Sarah away, Ben and Claire embraced, trembling but relieved. The nightmare had finally ended. They watched as the blue lights of the police cars faded into the distance, taking Sarah and her twisted obsession with them. Despite the trauma, they knew they were free to rebuild their lives, forever grateful to have escaped with their lives and each other.